The afternoon of March 15th, 1964, was cool and overcast in Harlem, with temperatures in the low 40s and gray clouds suggesting that rain might arrive before evening. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 116 Street was relatively quiet, with fewer pedestrians than usual due to the cold weather and the fact that most people were either at work or inside their homes trying to stay warm. St. Martin's Episcopal Church was located on Lenox Avenue, near 122nd Street, and had served Harlem's African-American community since the early 1900s. The church was a modest stone building with Gothic-style windows and a small bell tower that had been constructed in 1910. The congregation numbered approximately 400 members and was led by Reverend Thomas James, who was 53 years old and had served as pastor for 12 years. Reverend James was known as a dedicated community leader who operated a food pantry, provided meeting space for civil rights organizations, and offered sanctuary to young people trying to avoid street violence. At approximately 2:15 on the afternoon of March 15th, a black Cadillac sedan pulled up to the curb in front of St. Martin's Episcopal Church. Two men emerged from the vehicle. The first was Vincent Napoli, who was approximately 40 years old, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit and overcoat. The second was Anthony Russo, who was younger, perhaps 30, also wearing a suit and carrying himself with the casual confidence of someone who expected his presence to command respect. Both men were members of the Genovese crime family and worked under the authority of a capo named Michael Carbone, who controlled loan sharking and protection rackets in parts of Harlem and the Bronx. Vincent Napoli and Anthony Russo entered the church through the main doors and found Reverend James in his office, a small room off the main sanctuary that contained a desk, filing cabinets, and shelves filled with theological books and church records. Reverend James was working on the following Sunday's sermon when the two men appeared in his doorway without knocking or announcing themselves. Napoli stated that he represented business interests in the neighborhood and that St. Martin's Church would need to pay $500 per month for protection services. Napoli explained that the neighborhood was dangerous, that church property could be damaged by vandals or thieves, and that paying for protection would ensure that nothing unfortunate happened to the building or to Reverend James personally. Reverend James understood immediately what was happening. Protection rackets were common in parts of New York City where organized crime operated, and Reverend James had heard stories from other pastors about being pressured to make regular payments to criminal organizations. Reverend James stated that the church was a house of God, that it served poor families who could barely afford to keep the lights on, and that he would not pay money to criminals who contributed nothing to the community. Napoli's demeanor changed. His voice became harder, less cordial. Napoli stated that Reverend James was making a mistake, that the $500 per month was not a request but a requirement, and that refusing would have consequences. Napoli mentioned the church windows could be broken, that the food pantry could be vandalized, that Reverend James himself might encounter difficulties walking home at night. Napoli stated that he would return in 1 week to collect the first payment and that Reverend James should think carefully about his decision. Reverend James sat at his desk feeling a combination of anger, fear, and helplessness. The anger came from the brazenness of criminals demanding money from a church that served Harlem's poorest residents. The fear came from knowing that the Genovese family had resources to make good on their threats. At the helplessness came from understanding that calling the police would accomplish nothing. Police corruption meant that many officers ignored organized crime activities, and even honest officers had limited ability to protect someone who had antagonized a Mafia family. Reverend James did not immediately respond to Napoli's threats. Reverend James simply stated that he had heard what Napoli said and that Napoli could leave now. Napoli and Russo exchanged glances that suggested they found Reverend James's calm response either admirable or foolish. The two men left the church, got back into their Cadillac, and drove away. Reverend James sat alone in his office for several minutes after they left. Reverend James understood that he faced a serious problem with no obvious solution. If he paid the $500 monthly, and the church would have to cut programs that fed hungry families and provided after-school activities for children. If he refused to pay, the church might face vandalism, violence, or worse. Reverend James had no money to hire private security, no political connections powerful enough to pressure the Genovese family, and no legal recourse that would provide protection against organized crime. That evening, Reverend James mentioned the situation to his wife, Dorothy, who was 50 years old and worked as a schoolteacher. Dorothy suggested that Reverend James speak with someone who might have influence in situations involving organized crime. Dorothy mentioned that Ellsworth Johnson, known as Bumpy, had been back in Harlem for several months after his release from Alcatraz, and that people said Johnson protected Harlem institutions from outside interference. Reverend James was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of seeking help from a criminal. Reverend James had devoted his life to the church and to serving God, and the thought of involving himself with someone who ran illegal gambling operations and who had been convicted of drug trafficking violated every principle Reverend James held dear. But Reverend James also recognized that he had no other options that would actually protect his congregation. On the morning of March 16th, Reverend James walked to a barber shop on 125th Street that was known as a place where messages could be left for Bumpy Johnson. Reverend James spoke with the owner, explained that he needed to speak with Johnson about a matter affecting St. Martin's Church, and left contact information. Reverend James was told that if Johnson was interested in speaking with him, someone would be in touch. Later that afternoon, a man appeared at St. Martin's Church and stated that Johnson would meet with Reverend James at 7 o'clock that evening at a restaurant on Lenox Avenue. Reverend James went to the restaurant at the appointed time and found Johnson sitting at a table in the back, away from the windows. Johnson was 58 years old at this point, thin and dignified in appearance, dressed in a well-tailored suit. Johnson gestured for Reverend James to sit down. Reverend James explained what had happened, that Vincent Napoli and Anthony Russo had come to the church demanding $500 monthly for protection, that they had threatened violence if he refused, and that they planned to return in 1 week to collect the first payment. Reverend James stated that the church could not afford to pay and that he had nowhere else to turn for help. Johnson listened without interruption, asking only a few clarifying questions about Napoli and Russo's appearance, what exactly they had said, and whether Reverend James had noticed anyone else watching the church. When Reverend James finished explaining the situation, Johnson sat quietly for approximately 30 seconds before responding. Johnson stated that Reverend James should not pay the money and should not worry about the threats. Johnson stated that he would handle the situation and that Napoli and Russo would not return to the church. Johnson asked only that Reverend James tell no one about their conversation and continue operating the church normally. Reverend James agreed, left the restaurant, and returned to his home feeling uncertain whether Johnson would actually help, but having no alternative plan. Johnson spent the next several hours thinking carefully about what Reverend James had described and what it represented. The immediate problem was that two Genovese family members were extorting a Harlem church, but Johnson recognized that the extortion attempt represented a much larger issue about boundaries, authority, and the long-standing arrangements that governed how organized crime operated in Harlem. Since 1935, when Lucky Luciano had arranged Dutch Schultz's murder and negotiated a deal with Johnson, there had been an understanding that Harlem's illegal gambling operations would be controlled by black operators who paid tribute to the Italian families, while the Italian families would not directly operate in Harlem or interfere with Harlem community institutions. This arrangement had endured for nearly 30 years because it was mutually beneficial. The Italian families received steady income without the complications of operating in a neighborhood where they would be highly visible, while Johnson and other black operators had autonomy to run their businesses without constant interference. Johnson's decade in Alcatraz had disrupted these arrangements. When Johnson returned to Harlem in 1963, he discovered that the Genovese family had expanded their direct operations in the neighborhood, no longer content to simply receive tribute from black operators. The extortion attempt against St. Martin's Church represented an escalation. The Genovese family was now targeting legitimate community institutions rather than confining themselves to illegal businesses. Johnson understood that responding effectively required addressing both the specific threat to St. Martin's Church and the broader pattern of Genovese family encroachment into Harlem. Simply threatening Napoli and Russo would accomplish little. They would report back to their capo, Michael Carbone, who might send different people or escalate the pressure. What was needed was a response that would make the Genovese family leadership conclude that extorting Harlem churches was too costly and too risky to continue. Johnson spent March 17th and 18th gathering intelligence about the Genovese family's current operations in Harlem and about the specific individuals involved in the church extortion attempt. Johnson enlisted 6 trusted associates who conducted systematic investigation into who Vincent Napoli and Anthony Russo were, who they worked for, what other businesses they were targeting, where they lived, what their patterns of movement were, and what vulnerabilities could be exploited. The investigation revealed extensive information within 48 hours. Vincent Napoli was a soldier in the Genovese family who had worked in Brooklyn for 15 years before being assigned to Harlem operations in 1963. Napoli lived in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, with his wife and 3 children. Anthony Russo was Napoli's associate, younger and less experienced, who handled collection duties and enforced Napoli's demands. Both men reported to Michael Carbone, a capo who controlled loan sharking and protection operations across Harlem and the South Bronx. Most significantly, the investigation revealed that Napoli and Russo had been systematically targeting Harlem businesses and institutions for extortion over the past 4 months. They had already collected protection money from 12 small businesses, including grocery stores, dry cleaners, and restaurants. Saint. A Martin's Church was not an isolated target, but part of a broader campaign to extract money from Harlem establishments. The investigation also revealed that Carbone had begun this expansion without approval from senior Genovese family leadership, gambling that extracting money from Harlem would be tolerated if it generated sufficient revenue. Johnson recognized that Carbone's unauthorized expansion created an opportunity. If Johnson could demonstrate that Carbone's Harlem operations were generating problems rather than profits, the Genovese family leadership would have reason to shut down Carbone's activities and reaffirm the traditional boundaries. This required making Carbone's operations fail visibly and systematically. Johnson spent March 19th through March 21st developing a comprehensive strategy that would operate through multiple channels simultaneously. The strategy involved cutting off Carbone's revenue streams, creating public attention that would embarrass the Genovese family, mobilizing community opposition, generating law enforcement pressure, and coordinating with elements of the Genovese family who preferred the traditional arrangement. The first component was economic disruption. Johnson instructed associates to visit every business that was paying protection money to Napoli and Russo and to offer those businesses Johnson's protection at no cost. The business owners were informed that they should stop paying Napoli and Russo immediately, that Johnson would ensure no retaliation occurred, and that if Napoli or Russo threatened them, they should report this to Johnson's network. Within 3 days, all 12 businesses stopped making payments to the Genovese collectors. The second component was public exposure. Johnson contacted Reverend James and instructed him to organize a meeting of Harlem religious leaders to discuss the extortion attempts against churches and businesses. The meeting was held on March 23rd at Abyssinian Baptist Church and was attended by ministers from 15 Harlem congregations. The ministers drafted a letter to the Amsterdam News, Harlem's main newspaper, describing the extortion campaign and calling for community resistance and law enforcement action. The Amsterdam News published the letter on March 25th, creating public attention to the Genovese family's activities. The third component was community mobilization. Johnson worked with ministers and community leaders to organize residents to document and report any extortion attempts or threats. A telephone network was established where business owners could immediately report intimidation. This network made it difficult for Napoli and Russo to operate quietly. Every interaction was observed and documented by community members who were now alert to their presence. The fourth component was law enforcement pressure. Johnson contacted Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, Jr., who had significant influence with law enforcement and city government. Powell made inquiries with the NYPD about organized crime extortion in Harlem, creating pressure on police commanders to demonstrate they were addressing the problem. Police increased patrols around businesses that had been targeted and began documenting Genovese family activities in the neighborhood. The fifth component was internal pressure within the Genovese family. Johnson had maintained relationships with several Genovese family members who preferred the traditional arrangement where Harlem operators paid tribute but were otherwise left alone. Johnson contacted these individuals through intermediaries and explained that Carbone's unauthorized expansion was creating problems, generating bad publicity, mobilizing community opposition, attracting law enforcement attention, and disrupting established revenue streams. These Genovese family members began questioning whether Carbone's activities were worth the complications they were generating. The sixth component was direct demonstration of capability. Johnson arranged for surveillance teams to document Napoli's and Russo's movements for 1 week. Detailed logs were compiled showing where they went, who they met, what routes they drove, where their families lived, where they ate lunch, and what times they arrived home each night. This documentation was intended to demonstrate that Johnson had complete visibility into their activities and could act against them at any time if necessary. These 6 components began operating simultaneously on March 19th, 6 days after Napoli and Russo had first visited St. Martin's Church. The cumulative effects created immediate and escalating problems for Carbone's Harlem operations. By March 20th, Napoli and Russo discovered that the 12 businesses they had been collecting from had all stopped paying. And when Napoli visited these businesses to demand payment, the owners stated that they were under Johnson's protection and would not pay any more. Napoli understood immediately that Johnson was challenging the Genovese family's operations, but Napoli also recognized that threatening these business owners would likely trigger a violent confrontation with Johnson's organization. By March 22nd, Napoli reported to Carbone that revenue from Harlem had stopped completely. Carbone instructed Napoli to continue collection efforts and to proceed with the church extortion as planned to demonstrate that the Genovese family would not retreat in response to pressure. Carbone believed that extracting money from St. Martin's Church would show Harlem residents that Johnson could not protect them and would restore the Genovese family's authority. By March 25th, the Amsterdam News published the minister's letter describing extortion attempts against Harlem churches and businesses. The article created public attention and embarrassment for the Genovese family. Senior Genovese leadership, who valued operating quietly without attracting media coverage or law enforcement scrutiny, began questioning why Carbone's Harlem operations were generating negative publicity. By March 26th, police increased their presence around Harlem businesses and began stopping and questioning known Genovese family associates. While these stops rarely resulted in arrests, they made it difficult for Napoli and Russo to operate without constant police attention. The increased law enforcement presence was noted by senior Genovese leadership, who were already concerned about federal investigations into organized crime. By March 28th, contacts within the Genovese family began reporting to senior leadership that Carbone's Harlem expansion was creating multiple problems. Lost revenue from businesses that had stopped paying, public exposure through newspaper coverage, increased law enforcement scrutiny, mobilized community opposition, and potential conflict with Johnson that could turn violent. Several Genovese family members argued that Carbone should be ordered to retreat from Harlem and return to the traditional arrangement. On March 22nd, the date when Napoli and Russo were supposed to return to St. Martin's Church to collect the first protection payment, they did not appear. Carbone had instructed them to delay the collection while he assessed the broader situation and determined how to respond to Johnson's challenge. Johnson used this delay to intensify the pressure. Johnson arranged for packages to be delivered to Napoli's home in Bensonhurst and to Russo's apartment in Queens. Each package contained photographs documenting their movements over the previous week. Napoli leaving his home each morning, Russo meeting associates at a diner, both men driving through Harlem, Napoli's children walking to school, Russo's girlfriend shopping for groceries. The packages contained no threats, No written messages, simply dozens of photographs demonstrating that their activities and their families had been under constant surveillance. The photographs communicated a clear message. Johnson's organization had the capability to monitor and potentially harm Napoli, Russo, and their families at any time. The decision not to act on this capability, but simply to demonstrate its existence, was more unsettling than any direct threat would have been. It indicated restraint, patience, and strategic thinking rather than impulsive violence. Napoli called Carbone immediately after receiving the photographs. Napoli stated that Johnson's organization had been following him and his family, that they had extensive documentation of his movements, and that continuing to operate in Harlem seemed extremely dangerous. Carbone told Napoli to remain calm and wait for instructions. Johnson also arranged for information to be delivered to senior Genovese family leadership through mutual contacts. The information detailed Carbone's unauthorized expansion into Harlem, the specific businesses being extorted, the attempt to extort St. Martin's Church, the community mobilization against these activities, and the newspaper coverage that was creating unwanted attention. The information was presented as a matter of concern about activities that violated the long-standing arrangement between Johnson and the Italian families and that were generating unnecessary complications. By early April, approximately 3 weeks after Napoli and Russo had first visited St. Martin's Church, the situation reached a resolution. Senior Genovese family leadership, concerned about the publicity, law enforcement attention, and potential for violence, ordered Carbone to cease all extortion activities in Harlem and to withdraw his people from the neighborhood. The order came through the Genovese family's chain of command and was not presented as a victory for Johnson, but rather as a strategic decision to avoid complications. Carbone complied with the order, but attempted to preserve some face by stating that the Harlem operations had never been profitable enough to justify continued investment. This explanation fooled no one. Everyone understood that Johnson had systematically dismantled Carbone's operations and had generated sufficient pressure through multiple channels that the Genovese family leadership had concluded retreat was preferable to escalation. Napoli and Russo stopped all collection activities in Harlem. The 12 businesses that had been paying protection money continued operating under Johnson's protection without making any payments. St. Martin's Church never received another visit from Genovese family representatives. Carbone's authority within the Genovese family was diminished because his unauthorized expansion had failed and had created problems for the family. The resolution of the church extortion attempt created effects that extended far beyond St. Martin's Episcopal Church. The demonstration that Johnson could protect Harlem institutions from Italian Mafia encroachment reinforced his authority in the neighborhood. The successful mobilization of ministers, business owners, and community members created confidence that collective action could resist organized crime pressure. The coordination with law enforcement through Congressman Powell demonstrated that legitimate political pressure could complement other forms of resistance. The reaffirmation of traditional boundaries between Johnson's organization and the Genovese family stabilized criminal operations in Harlem. The Genovese family continued receiving tribute from black gambling operators, but stopped attempting to directly extort Harlem businesses or institutions. This arrangement was more stable than Carbone's aggressive expansion had been because it respected the reality that operating in Harlem required either Johnson's cooperation or constant costly conflict. For Reverend James and St. Martin's Church, the resolution provided profound relief, but also moral complexity. The church had been saved from extortion, but only through the intervention of a criminal who operated illegal gambling operations and who himself extracted money from Harlem's underground economy. Reverend James never publicly acknowledged Johnson's role in protecting the church, maintaining the public fiction that the Genovese family had simply decided to stop their extortion campaign. But Reverend James understood the reality and struggled with the knowledge that his church's safety depended on someone whose activities the church officially condemned. The precedent that churches and community institutions were protected from outside criminal interference became part of Harlem's understood rules. Other Italian crime families observed what had happened to Carbone's operation and concluded that attempting to extort Harlem churches would trigger responses that would be costly and embarrassing. This deterrent effect operated for years afterward. With Harlem, religious institutions generally exempted from the protection rackets that affected other parts of New York City. The successful defense also reinforced Johnson's reputation as someone who protected Harlem community institutions, even when doing so conflicted with his own criminal interests. The protection of St. Martin's Church generated no revenue for Johnson and actually cost money in terms of the resources dedicated to surveillance, intelligence gathering, and coordination. But the protection enhanced Johnson's authority and legitimacy in Harlem by demonstrating that he defended community institutions against outside threats. The case illustrated principles that characterized Johnson's most effective exercises of power throughout the 1960s. The response to the church extortion had been strategic rather than emotional. Johnson had not immediately confronted Napoli and Russo, but had instead developed a comprehensive strategy that operated through multiple channels: economic pressure by cutting off revenue, public exposure through newspaper coverage, community mobilization through religious leaders, law enforcement pressure through political contacts, internal pressure within the Genovese family through established relationships, and demonstration of surveillance capability through the photographs. The coordination across these different domains created cumulative pressure that made Carbone's operations unsustainable. No single element would have been sufficient. Cutting off revenue alone would not have forced retreat. Newspaper coverage alone would not have stopped the extortion. Surveillance alone would not have convinced senior Genovese leadership to intervene. But the combination of economic loss, public embarrassment, law enforcement attention, internal questioning, and demonstrated capability to harm created a situation where retreat became the rational choice. The patience with which Johnson had implemented the strategy, allowing weeks to pass while different pressure points were established and while information moved through various channels, reflected an understanding that lasting resolutions required changing the calculations of decision-makers rather than simply defeating specific individuals. Napoli and Russo were not the real targets. Carbone was not the real target. The real target was the Genovese family leadership's assessment of whether operating in Harlem was worth the complications. The story of how the Genovese family had attempted to extort St. Martin's Church, and how Johnson had forced them to retreat, became one of many narratives that circulated in Harlem about Johnson's protection of community institutions. The story emphasized the systematic nature of the response. The coordination of economic disruption, public exposure, community mobilization, law enforcement pressure, internal family politics, and demonstrated surveillance capability, and the speed with which these coordinated actions had forced a powerful criminal organization to withdraw from Harlem. Whether remembered precisely or embellished through retelling, the narrative captured essential truths about how Johnson understood power and how he exercised authority in Harlem during the 1960s. Protection of community institutions was non-negotiable. Threats to churches triggered responses that were strategic rather than impulsive. Economic and political pressure applied systematically across multiple domains could force powerful organizations to retreat. Coordinating across different sectors, business owners, religious leaders, law enforcement, political figures, internal family contacts, created leverage that individual actions could not achieve. Demonstrating capability without immediately exercising it could be more effective than direct violence. The legacy extended beyond the specific case of St. Martin's Church. The precedent that Harlem churches were protected from organized crime extortion influenced how criminal organizations operated in the neighborhood for years afterward. At the demonstration that community institutions could mobilize collective resistance with Johnson's support created confidence in collective action that would influence civil rights activism. The success of coordinating legitimate political pressure through Congressman Powell with illegitimate criminal pressure through Johnson's organization illustrated how power operated across legal and illegal domains simultaneously. These outcomes required no celebration or exaggeration to demonstrate their value. A church had been protected. A criminal expansion had been stopped. Traditional boundaries had been reaffirmed. Community institutions had demonstrated collective strength. Precedent had been established. Authority had been confirmed. The legacy endured. St. Martin's Episcopal Church continued serving Harlem's community for decades afterward. Reverend James remained pastor until his retirement in 1975 and never spoke publicly about the extortion attempt or Johnson's intervention. The church's food pantry and community programs continued operating without interruption. The congregation never knew how close their church had come to being pressured into paying protection money or how that threat had been eliminated. Johnson lived another 4 years after the incident at St. Martin's Church. Johnson died on July 7, 1968, of a heart attack at Wells Restaurant in Harlem. His funeral was held at St. Martin's Episcopal Church on July 11, 1968, attended by thousands of Harlem residents who came to pay respects to someone they considered a protector of their community. Reverend James presided over the service. Speaking about Johnson's role in defending Harlem institutions without specifying what that defense had entailed. The quiet power of the resolution, documented, strategic, effective, lasting, stood in contrast to the dramatic narratives that often characterized stories about criminal figures. There was no shootout, no theatrical confrontation, no spectacle. There was only systematic investigation, strategic planning, multi-pronged coordination, sustained execution, and complete neutralization of a threat through methods that combined economic pressure, political influence, community mobilization, and demonstrated capability. This was the reality of how power operated when wielded by people who understood that systems required systematic responses, that criminal organizations made decisions based on cost-benefit calculations that could be manipulated, that legitimate and illegitimate institutions could be coordinated to achieve outcomes neither could accomplish alone, and that real victories were measured not by dramatic moments, but by lasting changes in how organizations behaved and how communities were treated.